My name's Alice Anderson, and I work at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. I think I'm the only art museum person at this conference. Should anyone disagree with that? No, only one. I know there's lots of children's museum folks here, playful learning spaces, and so what I'm going to be talking about today is learning from organizations that have taken on maker education in the past 4 or 5 years, and my understanding of sort of how different types of organizations have pitched this to their stakeholders and how they've positioned or framed it for their audiences. Before I begin, it'd be great to know sort of who's in the room or what sort of organization or type of learning space that you represent. And I think we're small enough, I might just go around if that's okay. Do you mind if I start with you? I see Bridget.
I'm Bridget. I am a third grade teacher here at Madison.
Wonderful. Nice to meet you.
I'm Chuck, middle school teacher in Marathon.
Okay.
Hi, Mark Ruffle, with the National Endowment for Humanity.
Okay. Go for it.
I'm Liz. I'm a student in the development.
Okay.
I'm Nadia Dupree. I work at Madison
Children's Museum. Okay.
I'm Christina. I'm a graduate student from Northwestern and the founder of the Research Body Marketing.
Mini Maker Fair, is that what I heard you say? Okay.
I'm George Seaberg with the Wisconsin Art Board.
Okay. Great to have you all here. Okay. So, let's see. To start, I'll just say that I used to work at the Science Museum in Minnesota, and as part of doing that work, I was introduced to the organization Maker Ed, which I think many of us might know about. They're a national nonprofit organization that helps support other organizations get up to speed with making. And I got to work with them as their evaluator. So program evaluator basically, how effectively were their programs reaching their audiences? They have a number of different kinds of programs. And those have changed over time, but they're really thinking about capacity building for organizations themselves instead of hiring Maker Ed to kind of do it for them. So as a result, they've really met a lot of different organizations, and it's very interesting to listen to and watch what people say that their reasons are for taking on making. And through some work I did with some case studies, I came to sort of think about three types of organizations, and some commonalities they had between them. So I'll be curious to hear your thoughts, but here's what I heard often of why people say they take on maker education in their space. Does this resonate with you? What more would you add to this list as like that general like soft conversation that you're having at a conference like this about like, oh, why do you do making? What else have you heard?
So we get engaged, rather than just talking to kids.
Get kids engaged in learning, okay. Like a way into something. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Creative problem solving.
Mm-hmm. And interesting that you add those 3 words together, because some people say creativity and some people say problem solving. Creative problem solving, I think, is a more robust term that I like as well. Okay, well, why don't we keep going and I'll see what we add to this. So the 3 kind of spaces that we're going to talk about today are libraries, schools, and I added museums and tech centers together, mostly in terms of their size and scope, although I understand that those are kind of different. And just like not to forget that making also happens in lots and lots of other spaces, particularly after school organizations, summer camps, individual teachers who might be doing it kind of on their own with or without much support within their own district. And then partnerships through national organizations like the Girl Scouts or Boys and Girls Clubs, which Maker Ed has started to do more and more of. I mean, it's really sort of that scaling up the reach of, for example, the Girl Scouts in Northern California are opening some STEM centers, and so some STEM centers of innovation, and so they've partnered with Maker Ed to train some facilitators, think about materials, so that they can still be locally relevant in their different centers, but have this basis for what's the pedagogy, what does material look like, what are the passions that kids might be bringing to the table. So I'm going to start with libraries. And I wish Rebecca Miller-John, who represents the Madison Public Library Bubbler space, is actually presenting at the same time, but she's someone who also has informed this work. But I'm going to speak on behalf of someone I met at the Keene Public Library in Keene, New Hampshire. And she's been a librarian for a very long time, mostly in families and sort of middle grades activities. And she told me when we were talking, when I went to visit her, that she felt like taking on making was particularly relevant for her because she thought that it was basically a service that others were being able to, I shouldn't quite say it that way, but it was included in the package of what they wanted to offer to their constituents, I guess you could say. And she specifically pointed to, in the mission statement of the Keene Public Library, that there was the word curiosity. And not just inspiring curiosity, which is often actually what museums use, that sort of term, but to deepen, extend, and prompt curiosity that would lead to action. And so she felt like the maker movement was really one way to do it. She also saw it as a way of engaging local stakeholders, particularly local artists or craftsmen. She talked a lot about the region that she's in and sort of the decline in manufacturing. She talked about how businesses in the area, though, are still looking for those with a skill, especially sort of fine motor skill, systems thinking with regards to new, I guess, less, sort of supply chain processing, but the complex thinking that new manufacturing is bringing in, and that she thought there were some parallels with making as well. So here's just a couple of photos that I took when I was visiting her and their space. And so they were a Maker Corps participant a few years running. They had trouble finding folks locally who would be their Maker Corps members, and so they looked in the broader New England area, and that really helped them bring in some expertise that they didn't think they had locally. So you see here that they're doing 3D printing, they're using SketchUp, and they were working with a graduate student who was really, as their Maker Corps member, who was really interested in technology in the classroom. So he had a sort of his own play space to think about pedagogy for himself through that summer. Another library I visited is actually outside of Pittsburgh. It's called the Millvale Community Library. So this one is an independent library. It was founded as an independent library space and community space, not part of a public library system. So you could argue that this is a little bit of a different category too, like a community-based organization. Their mission statement is not just a library, but an agent for social change. And I think it's positive social change. And so they really saw themselves as a convener of people in a town that was, it's outside of Pittsburgh, not very big, and didn't have a local library. So some folks in the community, led by Brian Wolverich, who's also an educator, bought this space and started rehabbing it. So it's been open, I think, about 5 years. And what I'm showing you here is, I think, the first or second summer of things. So a little messy, like getting started here. On the top right is a woman named Nora Peters, who was their Maker Corps member at the time and went on to be their manager of Maker programs. And she's trying out a method of thinking about how, I guess you could say technology works, especially when you take it apart. It's called Parts, Purpose, and Complexities, and it's a thinking routine from Agency by Design. And so here in this library, there is very much a focus on kid exploration, getting messy, being playful, a place for kids to come. They paired it with a free lunch program in the summer, so kids and adults would come for that, stay for the making. They had different themes every day. So this sort of community gathering place that also had making going on. So in short, libraries, why are they doing this? Exposure to materials that kids might not have been familiar with, that I guess I should have put access next, because libraries as an open door organization were bringing these resources and exposing them to people who walk in their door for lots of different reasons. But what's hard for them? Staffing. Staffing is really hard for them. So many different complex funding situations, right? So Millvale was an independent organization for all long, it still is, but was not connected to the library system, which meant it could hire, but yet it had no money. So there was that. And then in public library systems, can be very challenging, similar to museums, to advocate for new positions, especially, again, where is this money coming from when there's no revenue coming through the door necessarily? You have to be lobbying up the chain. I think they also struggle with broad expertise. There's sort of a general, I want to help people who come through the door, but not necessarily the deep expertise in a content area, in a skill, or a software. And so that's where they were really looking to partnerships and looking to bring people in to offer that, do some capacity building for permanent staff, but also partner with local artists and local makers too. I didn't mention about Millvale that's something that they definitely did really well, where they sort of sponsored summer camp field trips that would meet at the library and then go out to tradespeople. So a welding company that was in town, carpentry, and they would sort of informally introduce, I guess formally, informally, in that it wasn't like summer camp for makers. It was like, hey, this week, whoever wants to show up, we're gonna head over to the wood shop. And then I think continually trying to figure out the fact that many interactions are gonna be one-offs with a patron or a visitor. And so what does that look like? How deep can you get into an experience? How do I know who's coming in? Are there ways for people to kind of check in with me or check in with the space? Are there ways to get people back time and again? We want to be open and convenient, but yet it's really wonderful to sort of have a deeper engagement with people over time. And that really has developed, I think, for both of these spaces over time. And I'll just add that I've stayed in touch with these places. I visited them 2 or 3 years ago, and Gail at the Keene Library mentioned that they're, I should have shown a picture, but they're building a new makerspace in a building that was next door. And so she's really excited about the possibilities there, but she wrote to me and she said staffing is still an issue. I don't know how we're gonna staff that up without heavily relying on volunteers. And it's sort of that, like, being a resource, being very giving, I think, that also then comes into conflict when you need to have permanent, staffing in a space that has lots of equipment and materials. And so she said, as a result, they may have to restrict some of the usage of some of their materials, whereas right now, it's in a room a fourth of the size of this, and so she's always around so she can keep an eye on things. So those are some of the tensions that I think libraries are dealing with. Does anyone want to add anything based on your experience with libraries? If you have anything that I missed that you were like, or I don't get that? Okay, just jump in. We're a small group, so please. So let's talk about schools a little bit. And the 2 schools I'm going to talk about are a little untraditional. One is a preschool. So that is, I realize, a very small percentage of the schools doing this. But again, really an interesting case study to think about. So this is Ryan Moreno speaking. They're in Miami, the REM Learning Center, and he and his wife both work there. The center was started by his parents, and so he's grown up around early childhood, but he also has his advanced degree in mechanical engineering, or rather electrical engineering, forgive me, and his wife is a PhD in developmental psychology. So when I met them, I was like, you what? How is this all this expertise in this tiny childcare center in Miami? So they decided to create a makerspace in their space, but also do some integration with the classrooms. And it's an infant to actually kindergarten childcare center, so they have lots of ages. And so they talked to me about the models they were playing around with, whether to have a separate space, and yes, they have a separate space where there are hot glue guns and there are soldering irons and there are computers that they can do coding on, but then also rethinking the materials and what could be added to classroom spaces, and then helping the educators in those classroom spaces see that what they were already doing with kids was very in alignment with making, but maybe thinking beyond or a little bit broader. I think he also talked about how there was a little bit of fear or intimidation on the behalf of the teachers to take on, especially new materials that might seem too techy, that early childhood educators may not have had the most experience with working with their young students. So when we spoke about why making, besides their personal passions for it, thinking about his students, he says that being able to adapt quickly to new information, new materials, new tools, and incorporate them into what they feel passionate about. So this sort of fluency, awareness, and skill with selecting materials, again, from a personal drive for creativity, expression. They call their program Play, Make, Share. And that last piece is really important, the share. The day I went, it was also dress up day. It was like the cutest day ever. It was just like the best. So you see some kids on the left working with little bits. Here's Ryan helping a firefighter soldering something, and Elsa, I suppose, doing some block coding over here too. And they were actually controlling a little robot down here, and she's checking in. She's still got her safety glasses on, because she must have been doing something else. So really there was the way that they would set it up was, let's meet at the table, let's think about what you want to make today, what might you need to use for that. Do some planning, especially for older students, and by older I mean like the 5-year-olds, and then go. You have free reign in this space. You can do it. If you've never used a hammer before, no big deal. Come and check in with me and I'll help you. So again, here we're talking about low teacher to kid ratios, so there's lots of ability for oversight, but that freedom and not just permission, but encouragement, I guess, to use whatever is available here as tools for making what you feel personally passionate about. And I would say, I also love the picture on the top right, because I feel like it really expresses everything about this place. So you can see Ryan's hands are helping him, but not doing it for him. So really a supporting role of independence was a value that they really brought to all of this, and they saw that including new material and ways of thinking that really centered around this planfulness and thinking about how you document your process would only support the goals that they had for early childhood education. So when I just spoke with them recently, they said, wow, I said, oh my gosh, that visit was 3 years ago. It feels like forever, but we're still trucking along. And I think the thing that I've found even more important is that planning piece. So creative problem solving for sure, but also developing that skill in young children of being planful, being resourceful. What are the steps that I need to plan, and what happens if something doesn't work out the way I expect it to? That resiliency and adaptability, making that more supported through all kids' experiences. When I was there, it was sort of like here and there, if kids kind of did it on their own, they were really encouraging, but it wasn't really kind of a foundation for their program. So they're a great place to know about. The other place I want to feature is a place called Progressive Arts Alliance in Cleveland, Ohio. And they're not a school, but they're a teaching artists group. And so they work with mostly schools. And when I was visiting them in the summer, they were technically at a library, so I understand I'm crossing boundaries here, but that's what making is all about. But the reason I put it in schools really because it had an educational focus. It was a week-long summer camp in a library. 15 kids signed up, and it was led by 2 or 3 teaching artists instructors. It really had a curriculum. It was not just come in, try things out. It was a 2D to 3D camp. So they were thinking about how objects are constructed all the way from sketching and drawing from pictures to folding paper into the shapes that a cube would look like out of, how do you take a blank piece of paper and fold it in to look like a cube? You see the inflatables on the left, that led into an inflatables unit. So they're building with this sort of like mylar, and there's a fan at the bottom blowing that up. And then it led into sort of 3D with the doodle pens, the 3D doodler pens, and then making their own 3D objects in SketchUp as well. So it was a whole arc. And so that's why I kind of put it in this focused learning, stepping through multiple media to think about a holistic thing. And the other reason I added it into schools is because there was a real emphasis on feedback. So what she's doing on the left here, the woman standing is a Maker Corps member. She was really leading an art critique with a bunch of 11-year-olds in the most supportive, but also, productively critical, I would call it, ways. So I just was really struck by the fact that so these girls are standing up talking about what they made, and you can see a girl pointing. She's describing what she sees, what she likes about it. And then the teaching artist says, I notice, I think it was this one, you can see she's kind of holding it up. She's like, you notice this is falling over. What would you do differently if we had more time to make it erect? And she's like, well, I'd put a yardstick in it. And the teaching artist was like, there are no yardsticks and inflatables. Like, think about when you drive by the, car dealership and you see the I don't know what to call them, but people, waving people, I don't know. She's like, keep thinking. So she kind of pushed a little bit. She wasn't just like, sure, that's a good idea. There was, and I hesitate to use the word critique because I know it has a real negative connotation for some people. But what I'm trying to convey is that there was a push in thinking that sometimes is absent, I think, in informal spaces. A lot, and I'll move on to museums in a minute. But sometimes in museums we're just excited about like exposure and explore whatever. But this really had a push your thinking, creatively problem solve, and let's think about what we've learned in this camp. How might you construct or add a support to the bottom to make it fly erect? So I felt like that was a really solid foundation for this teaching artist organization. They also do, just as an aside, they do a lot with scratch and hip hop dancing. I don't know if they've talked about this work at various places like this. So if you've ever seen them present on that, this is them. They're really great. So, summarizing schools a little bit. Why do they do it? Okay, because you're learning something that can be really broadly defined. It can be the sort of soft skills. It could be content, although I heard less about that when in these particular schools. And I realize I'm sort of picking outsidery schools, not your typical K-12 environment, but we could talk about that a little bit at the end too. Often there's an interdisciplinary focus or approach, and finally this drive for personalization and ownership. So I've also spent some time in middle schools that do making, and I think that is the biggest driver. This is a place where kids can make their own decisions. They have agency, they have control over what they're making. Kind of going back up, they're bringing in what they are passionate about, either in design, in arts, computer science, and they're expressing themselves, and they're getting better at it. They're learning as they do it. That's sort of the narrative that I think schools are using often. But what's hard about that, sometimes it's the space. Who owns the space in schools especially? Is it a separate space? You're not, Brendan's like, yes. Yeah, is it a separate space? Is it in your classrooms? If it is, who control? All of that is just big questions that don't have an easy answer. Getting others on board. So often I think in schools, there's someone passionate about something and then either it spreads or you remain isolated. I mean, I've seen that happen with the arts as well. And then what's hard, assessment and evaluation sometimes can be not a motivator, but something that educators I've heard say that they want to be able to show to stakeholders, yes, my kids are learning something and here's how I know it. Well, assessment and evaluation tools for makerspaces are just in their infancy. There's many projects active right now, of which I can talk about. I'm involved in one of them to develop things, but they're certainly in their development and prototyping phase too. So that's sort of a big open question, I think, for schools. Do you want to add anything based on your own experiences as teachers? Do you do making right now? Is this a topic in your schools?
We have in our school, our librarian has a makerspace. But I often feel I'm stepping on her toes too, because some of the stuff she's got there I do
Uh-huh.
I do STEM and STEAM stuff regularly.
Yep.
and Kind of open-ended type things for them, for the kids.
Mm-hmm. I think that's real common too. In my son's school, that's the same. In the middle school we were in, the librarian was kind of the champion
Yeah.
and the owner. Yeah. What about
I'm new to my job, so
Oh.
just trying to find
wide open
where it
field?
fits. Yeah, really.
Yeah,
And
okay.
So many things.
Any other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
Interesting that under what's hard, you don't have equipment. Because as
Great point.
in a school, there's a tug of war as to 3D printers and all
Mhm.
that stuff that people think they have to have a makerspace. And so
That's a great point. You're right. I didn't put that on there. I think, and I'm thinking back to the organizations I'm speaking about. When I asked the preschool, like, how did you get all this stuff? They said a combination of grants, our own personal money, and a little bit of fundraising. And I think that's kind of that's the alchemy for most most places too. Although I will say I've been in some schools where they're using what they have. You know, it's much more of a sort of a found object or recycling-based materials and then free online tools. And they really push that emphasis. But I do think there's the cult of the 3D printer that everyone thinks that they need to have. We can get into like why that you don't need that a little bit later, but that's a great point. Okay, in my final little bit, I'm going to talk about museums and tech centers. So like I said, I used to work at the Science Museum of Minnesota. I'm now at an art museum that, full disclosure, does not have a makerspace and really isn't really thinking all that deeply about making yet. It's really about art making, artistic practice. And I think there's not necessarily a huge divide, but sometimes, like those worlds aren't yet intersecting, I would say. So,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Tell us a little bit more about what the museum means by art making.
Sure, be happy to. So Minneapolis Institute of Art, and full disclosure, I'm also going to do a presentation this afternoon that's very much focused on that. And in terms of the art making that we offer, so sorry, just to back up, Free Museum, City of Minneapolis, Encyclopedic Museum of Antiquity to present day. And so what we offer in terms of art making are summer camps that are pretty specialized in terms of like, figure drawing or street art, trying to think, lettering, sort of that traditional artistic practice taught by teaching artists, puppetry, cardboard creations, those are kinds of things. We have a family day that's,
You don't consider those making?
I do,
Okay.
but I don't think that my colleagues, like for example, I said, hey, the Maker Faire is coming up. Who wants to come with me? And it was like crickets, It was like, what's that world? And so there's just not a dialogue happening in traditional art museums and making yet, is really what I'm trying to say. But I would say that what we're doing is very similar. The technology piece is pretty absent from art museums too, and not that that's essential to making, but that's really seems like, that's not our wheelhouse. Kind of leave that to science museums. But yeah, maybe as we keep talking, I can add on to your question. And I'm going to focus on two sort of science-focused museum and tech centers. So first is Digital Harbor Foundation in Baltimore. They're a community-based organization. They took over an unused rec center in Baltimore's Inner Harbor and have created a number of amazing programs for kids of all ages, families, and professional development as well. And here's Mary, she's their elementary educator programs teacher person. And she's saying the reason we do it is everybody's encouraged to try things they don't know how to do. That just misspelled, sorry about that. And there's a support system that has made me very comfortable to try lots of different things. So I think this idea of exposure is also active in science museums and tech centers, and being linked up to expertise. So, and in the real world, I'll get back to that, it's sort of our summary here, but Mary's also talking about the working environment at Digital Harbor, that the other educators and facilitators have a shared support system for for saying, I'm not totally sure how to do this, can you help show me? Or I'm gonna try this out with you guys, can you give me some feedback? And I think, I haven't talked too much about the organizational structures that support making, but I think that's a really important one, is to have colleagues for whom you trust. I mean, that's true of any job for sure, but especially as we model trying new things, taking risks, persistence, I think making is a particularly great place to do that. Maybe I'll do them. I'll just keep going with Digital Harbor. So here's Mary, she's crouching down, working with some kids. Some other systems that they've put in place to support their work. You see on the laptop there's a red and a green bar. Red means I need help. She's just flipped it up so that she can come over to talk to this kid. On the right, they were doing a toy camp, I think. And they have some diagrams of circuitry that were just sort of left up, but they were pretty clear. And so it was sort of you can refer to this if you need it. We're not a school necessarily in teaching you all this, but it's embedded in the work that we do, and I can point to it if I need to help you understand something. And then I'm gonna go to the Science Museum of Minnesota, which I probably know the most about, but they have a couple of different specific making programs, and the one here is called Play, Tinker, Make, which is on Saturdays, every Saturday, 12 to 4, and it's out on the museum floor. Here on the left you can see Milton, who's one of the Maker Corps members, manning one of the tables. There's 6 to 8 tables around the museum. It's included in your museum admission. The museum doesn't have a separate makerspace, which was, I think, both an intentional and unintentional reason. I've heard both be argued. The intentional is that, well, actually I don't know which is which. I'll just tell you. The education spaces are in the basement. As often, education spaces in museums are tucked into the corner down where the education entrance is. So there was a concern of if we made a makerspace, would people even find it? And is it communicating that it's truly other? That's like, you either have to be special or you're excluded to go down there. So that might be one literal reason. It may also have been that those spaces are in demand. We do a lot of school programming, we do a lot of summer camps. It probably would have been losing some space and giving it to that. So that might have been another reason. In the end, it's out on the museum floor. You stumble upon things. For a long time, they called it activate, out of your activating corners of the museums that would otherwise be quiet or not have anything in them. Another reason is that the Science Museum is really good at exhibits, right? Hands-on exhibits where you try phenomena, you watch phenomena, you play games, you look at dioramas, but there's not really a lot of playful making in the way that children's museums might have that are creative, endless exploration. So there wanted to be some opportunities for that. And I should add, we do summer camps as well. And those often have a making component as well. But what I wanted to highlight here, I think, continues that thread of support within your organization. So Milton and then Rachel in the top right were the Maker Corps members. The summer I was working with them, and actually you can hardly see him, but Keith is on the far right. And he is the Director of Learning Technologies at the Science Museum and was their supervisor. And he really held them accountable to try new things, to share it out with him, and to document it. So what Rachel's doing is shooting a short video about a new acids and bases activity that she has developed so that it will be saved for others to use. And Milton, this one is actually like a pretty well-vetted activity, but part of their work was to prototype new activities for the floor and also do some outreach and training for other groups. It really varied who that was, but often it was educators in another informal space, so like libraries or community centers. So we really pushed them and held them accountable to develop something on their own. They weren't just staff members to do what Keith wanted them to do. He wanted them to be creating on their own as well. And I think that's honestly a spirit of a lot of these places as well. So when we're thinking about these spaces, the reasons I think people give are, we want kids to develop skill, and we have some sort of content expertise to offer, or some sort of experience that will help them give them practice in this skill. There's lots of connections to the real world. I mean, the Science Museum highlights lots of scientists who are real people in your community doing real work. And then, again, this idea of personalization and ownership. So at a science museum, you're not really taking much away from it. You're not, at an art museum, if you come on family day, you're going to come away with a bug crown or whatever. At the science museum, you're going to come away with your memories. Usually there's not like a thing to take with you. So it's a way for people to sort of have that lasting memory of what you've created. And then I guess I'll add in the longer experiences like summer camps or in Digital Harbor where there's longer experiences, really getting deeper, having more deeply invested personal expression in a making experience. But what's hard? Facilitation is really hard. I didn't say just staffing because I think a lot of times people are excited to work at organizations like museums or tech centers where they seem like they're established, they have the cool stuff around, but helping people understand the pedagogy that's specific to making can sometimes be challenging, or is just there's not a lot of models for. And then I think the last two are really big organizational problems, right? Competing initiatives within the museum. So Keith was also told, like, I'm not going to give you any money to hire anyone. So he was like, okay, I guess I'll have volunteer facilitators, and models for sustainability. So for those facilitators, he said they typically last about 1.5 years, and then most of them move on to some other volunteer opportunities. So this sort of like, how do I, within a big organization that's making lots of decisions and about, sort of what's our mission and what's the margin, and sometimes you can get lost in the shuffle if you're not the biggest, brightest initiative or the most income producing, of which Pay Tinker Make is 0 income producing. Okay, so I'm going to move on to sort of like takeaways for my own thinking, and I hope that they resonate with you. So here's Keith, just again. So what's the secret? Why do people do this? So I made this tongue twister up because I think it really describes the folks that I have described here. They're mid-career, mid-level managers making matter. They're not at the way top. They're not entry level. They've kind of been around the block. They know how to work the system. That's not a great phrase to use here, but they know how things work, right, in their organization. They know who to ally with. They know how to position their argument up the chain. And they also have some agency to hire or to collaborate or partner and sort of make their own thing that can sometimes fly a little bit under the radar for a while they try things out, and then they can bring it up the ladder. That's something I didn't talk a lot about, and I think that the tools that have come out of the Making and Learning project out of Children's Museum in Pittsburgh do a really good job of good job of supporting the articulation of your program vision or goals. These places all had a clear idea of what am I trying to do here. They had an idea of what their strengths were, what was limitations were, and sometimes that came like at the very beginning of planning, and sometimes it developed over time. But by the time I had met with them, all of these places, they had at least been up and running for 2 or 3 years, and they had a good sense of sort of where they fit, and they had that vision statement and that mission statement that guided their work. I think all of these people and all of these places just have a deep curiosity about making, about people, about creative expression. It's just part of who they are. They genuinely care about the audience wants to do or learn. Keith and I sort of kicking around some phrases, and he came up with, I want contagious curiosity, both from the facilitator and from the kid. So how does that spark get kindled and caught and shared with others? But it comes from their audience, not necessarily from me as educator. I mentioned this community on site with independent tasks and accountability. And I think the last thing that really exemplifies the whole maker community is that they're very generous to one another. So there's online communities, there's spaces like this. People are willing to share whatever their program model is they're willing to share their DIY for making bug hats. Like, it is just a sharing community, and I think that lifts all of us up. Okay, so here's the like semi-critical, not critical, I'm gonna stop using that word, but wonderings. So first of all, does making education give people more latitude to experiment in their program models? Because making is like inherently sort of iterative and creative, and you're problem solving and going down dead ends, does that allow people who are making those program decisions to have more of that, and for those, I guess I keep saying kind of above them or who hold them accountable, more open to saying, okay, you're still trying things out, that's what making is about, I'll let you keep tinkering with that. Yeah, and are they held to different standards? For better or worse, I'm not saying either, but I'm just saying, is there something inherent about making? At what point do organizations stop tinkering with their core program models? So I think this is a little bit of just the maturity of spaces that I think really honestly, after I would say maybe 3 to 5 years, I've noticed that organizations sort of like know what is gonna work for them and they have it running, and so then it's what's the next thing, right? So are we gonna scale up? Are we gonna scale out? Are we gonna have more partners? Are we gonna introduce a new material? But I think it is a sort of, yeah, like I said, maturity model. I'm just gonna put the rest of these up because I think they're kind of related. I think this issue of community is ongoing too. It has been a loose organization of passionate people. There are, again, the Maker Ed convening is now in its 2nd year, so that's a place where people are going to be going to, but what happens more locally? I know I'm a part of, we call it playdates, Maker playdates, that someone hosts at a local university, and we just kind of come and play, and it's people from all over the city in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Challenges to this. And then I think really, what will we be talking about in another 5 years? Will it still be making, or will it be something else? Will it have evolved into yet another field that we're all excited about? So from my point of view, here are the things that I see on the horizon for Maker education. I mentioned assessment and evaluation tools, of which I can talk more about if you're interested. Training and professional development for facilitators, especially in the informal space, to sort of articulate that and share across the field. And then finally, bringing other spaces into the mix. So as I mentioned at the beginning, art museums have just sort of been like, that's not our thing, it's STEM. There's a loosening of that. I think there's a need for sort of some unpacking about what we need and really where the commonalities are. That visioning of, what does an art museum art space or maker space look like that might be different from the science museum art space or maker space. I don't actually think there's that much conflict. I just don't think there's been that much thought from the art museum perspective about it. So I hope to change that in my role. Yeah, and that's me for the end. Thoughts on what this resonated with you or questions you have? Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. So Maker Ed is 5, almost 6 years old. It's a very young organization. It has had some turnover, and actually the very first people to start it were based in Minnesota. And so they reached out to the Science Museum of Minnesota to say, can you help us with like a theory of change and like what our vision is? Very like, we're getting up and running. And that evolved, and by the time that I got introduced to them, they were really interested in program evaluation of their cornerstone program, which was called Maker Core, which was an opt-in. You could apply to be a Maker Core site, and you would receive professional development at a distance, so online hangouts, message board, individualized support, and this network of other people trying things out in a summer setting. And within that, you would then hire 1 to 4 Maker Core members who would work during the summer. Sometimes that was already staff members. So like REM Learning Center just hired the teachers that they already had, but asked them to take on an additional thinking role over the summer. Initially it was really to get sort of, initially it was funded by the Bill Clinton Foundation, so it had a sort of like workplace, like young adult from college to career workplace focus for those Maker Core members, and over time that became less of a focus for them. So that's like just a little bit of a background. So I was introduced to them to be their program evaluator for Maker Core. And then they also had a program called Maker Vista, which was a collaboration with the AmeriCorps Vista program. Same thing, doing some, logic modeling with them, doing surveys, that kind of thing. So the database you're mentioning was the Maker Core database of members. And so for the 4 to 5 years that was running, they had almost 40 organizations per year. And so the case studies I mentioned was a way for us to get a deeper dive. And so we selected them based on type of organization and also who we thought would be willing to talk to us, who had the capacity, honestly. So it's kind of a mix of those two reasons. They've now shifted, I don't know if you followed this, and it's a good thing they do have a lot of programs. So they now, let's see, I'll just click on this so that you all know. They now are focusing really on how to partner with schools, and that's on it's called Making Spaces. Maker Core is being a little bit phased out in that really big, broad reach across the country and thinking about local hubs of 4 organizations at a time coming together. So there's one in Colorado right now, and there's one in Texas right now, and getting a little more individualized attention. Young Makers is sort of after-school opt-in. There's something called the Young Makers Playbook, where you can sort of host your own making club. And then Maker Vista, actually they're phasing out as well. I think that was really, I don't know if anyone has worked with AmeriCorps Vista, but I'll just say there's a lot of paperwork. And I think it's something that they would have done anyway, and they didn't need to have the Vista support. So that is embedding someone who is identified as a maker educator, whatever their background is, in a community school to offer support for both educators, parents, and community members across the field. So that's like a big, broad overview of Maker Ed. They do have lists of who has participated in this in their website. The other thing I'll add is, so we did surveys of all those folks too. So I didn't really mention that, but a lot of that is coming through with the themes that I've identified. And finally, through some other work I do around the assessment and evaluation work, I've also sent out lots of surveys for people too. So it's sort of like the distillation of all those things. Well, we have, some of it is online in the impact reports, and then one of them we published last year is actually around the concept of failure, what people think about the concept of failure in their maker programs. And so I can tell you about that publication if you'd like, but it has that narrow focus on it. Yeah. That's a great question. I think that when I started thinking about this, that was not even on the horizon. I think the sort of like excitement about play and exploration was really the motivator. But as we've moved into this phase now of lots of places identifying that we do making, questions around assessment and evaluation are bubbling up. And some tools that I'm aware of are kind of content agnostic, right? So the project I'm a part of, we're looking at STEM practices, which is content, but it's this broad STEM practices: agency, creativity, critical thinking. I always forget the last one, but it doesn't matter. I think the programs that are partnering with schools are the ones that really are digging into content because they have teacher expertise to offer. But I think that the content of arts history, and even within that, there are variations too. To my knowledge, I don't know of many conversations that, again, are bridging across those to unpack differences, but I'm totally with you. I mean, that's a really interesting place to play. Yeah. Well, thank you for listening. I hope this sparked something for you, and feel free to stay in touch. Thanks.